By October 1942, Guadalcanal had become a festering wound for both the Empire of Japan and the United States Marine Corps. The fight was centered on a single, precious, 3,000-foot strip of gravel and mud known as Henderson Field. For the Americans, it was an unsinkable aircraft carrier. For the Japanese, it was a dagger pointed at their conquests in the South Pacific. The Japanese High Command, furious at their initial failures to retake the island, were massing thousands of troops from their elite Sendai Division for one final, overwhelming offensive designed to annihilate the American defenders and seize the airfield. Holding the perimeter around that field was the 1st Marine Division, a force that was now exhausted, sick, and starving. The men holding the line were not the fresh-faced heroes of war posters. They were gaunt skeletons, their uniforms rotting off their bodies from the constant, torrential rain and suffocating humidity. Malaria, dysentery, and jungle rot were as deadly as the enemy. Ammunition was scarce, food was scarcer, and the only certainty was that the Japanese were coming. The American line was a series of waterlogged foxholes and shallow machine gun pits carved into the mud, a thin red line separating the airfield from the dense, dark jungle that pressed in on all sides. This was the Lunga Perimeter, and in the rainy, pitch-black night of October 24th, 1942, the Japanese finally came. Their plan was a massive, coordinated banzai charge, a human wave assault designed to create shock, terror, and chaos. Exploiting the darkness and the storm to overrun the exhausted Marines before they could mount a defense. This was not a battle of tactics. It was a desperate, primitive struggle for survival. A meat grinder engagement where the fate of the entire Pacific campaign rested on the shoulders of a few thousand Marines clinging to their muddy holes in the ground. At the center of this desperate defensive line was a man who embodied the spirit of the old-breed Marine Corps gunnery sergeant John Basilone. He was not a rookie. He was a hardened, 6-year-old professional NCO. Basilone had already served a full enlistment in the USS Army, spending 3 years in the Philippines, where his prowess earned him the nickname Manila John. He was a soldier's soldier, a man who loved the structure and discipline of military life. After returning to the States, he found civilian life boring and quickly re-enlisted, this time with the Marines, stating simply, "I've come home." On Guadalcanal, he was in command of 2 heavy machine gun sections from the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. His weapons were the M1000 917 Browning heavy water-cooled machine guns that served as the backbone of the American defensive line. These guns were the anchors, the fixed points of firepower that were absolutely essential to breaking up the human wave banzai charges. Basilone was not a distant commander. He was a hands-on NCO, revered by his men for his technical expertise and his cool, profane confidence under fire. He was personally responsible for the placement of his guns, the fields of fire, and the morale of the men who operated them. As the Japanese build-up for the October offensive became obvious, Basilone spent his days preparing, digging in his guns, creating alternate positions, and ensuring his ammunition was dry and accessible. He knew that when the attack came, it would be his small, isolated sector that would bear the brunt of the assault. His men, terrified and exhausted, looked to him not just for orders, but for the will to fight. And as the first waves of the Japanese Sendai Division began to scream in the darkness, Manila John Basilone moved to his forward gun pit, ready to personally orchestrate the defense that would save Henderson Field. As the first wave of the Sendai Division slammed into his sector, John Basilone became a whirlwind of violent, focused energy. He was not a commander directing from the rear. He was a gunner, a mechanic, and a leader, physically dominating the battlefield. His two heavy M1917 machine guns were the linchpins of the entire defense, and the Japanese knew it. They targeted his pits with grenades, mortars, and concentrated rifle fire, but Basilone refused to be suppressed. The guns ran hot, literally. The M1917s were water-cooled, requiring a constant supply of water in their barrel jackets to prevent them from overheating and seizing. Under the strain of continuous, non-stop firing for hours on end, the water in the jackets boiled away, and the barrels began to glow, a dull, menacing red in the darkness. One gun, raked by enemy fire, was completely put out of action, its crew killed or wounded. The other gun jammed, its scorching hot mechanism clogged with mud and fouling, with Japanese soldiers already breaching the wire and mere yards away. Basilone, with complete disregard for his own life, grabbed the searing hot barrel and casing of the gun, burning his hands to the bone, and lifted the entire 93-pound weapon system. He carried it to a less exposed position, cleared the stoppage, and got it back into the fight. He then ran back through the storm of enemy fire, retrieved the second gun, and spent precious minutes stripping parts from the disabled weapon to repair the other, all while under direct attack. He was everywhere at once, firing the gun himself, screaming encouragement at his men, and dashing back through the mud to the supply lines, hauling 100-pound boxes of ammunition belts on his shoulders to feed the weapon that was single-handedly holding back the tide. As the hours dragged on, the relentless torrent of fire from Basilone's gun created a massive, steaming pile of brass and shattered Japanese bodies in front of his position, but the cost was becoming catastrophic. The non-stop firing meant their reserves were being consumed at a suicidal pace. The inevitable crisis arrived not with a spectacular explosion, but with a chilling, sudden finality. The belt in the last working machine gun ran out, the bolt snapped home on an empty casing, and the weapon fell utterly silent. The battle had been reduced to "the ammo is gone." This was the sound of certain death. In the deafening, chaotic noise of the battlefield, that silence in Basilone's sector was a vacuum instantly felt by both sides. The Japanese, sensing the sudden cessation of the devastating fire, renewed their push with fresh determination, screaming louder as they surged forward. Knowing they had finally killed the anchor of the marine defense, Basilone frantically tried to contact the supply point, only to discover the runners who had been hauling ammunition all night had been cut down or wounded, and the resupply line was completely severed. They were alone. Basilone and his surviving assistant gunner, Sergeant Nacella, checked every tin, every pouch, finding only scattered, loose rounds, not nearly enough to restart the heavy guns. The only functioning weapons left were the men's personal rifles and pistols, but against the thousands of determined attackers now closing in, these were utterly inadequate. The exhausted Marines around them, who had been relying on the heavy guns to break the human waves, looked on in stunned despair. Basilone knew that if the line broke here, Henderson Field would fall, and every American on the island would be trapped and executed. With the Japanese literally scrambling over the bodies of their dead and climbing the sandbag wall of the pit, Basilone saw the final wave coming directly toward the gaping, silent muzzle of his machine gun. He had minutes, maybe seconds, to solve a problem that artillery, air power, and 2 heavy machine guns had failed to solve. As the hours dragged on, the relentless torrent of fire from Basilone's gun created a massive, steaming pile of brass and shattered Japanese bodies in front of his position, but the cost was becoming catastrophic. The non-stop firing meant their reserves were being consumed at a suicidal pace. The inevitable crisis arrived not with a spectacular explosion, but with a chilling, sudden finality. The belt in the last working machine gun ran out, the bolt snapped home on an empty casing, and the weapon fell utterly silent. The battle had been reduced to "the ammo is gone." This was the sound of certain death. In the deafening, chaotic noise of the battlefield, that silence in Bazilone's sector was a vacuum instantly felt by both sides. The Japanese, sensing the sudden cessation of the devastating fire, renewed their push with fresh determination, screaming louder as they surged forward. Knowing they had finally killed the anchor of the Marine defense, Bazilone frantically tried to contact the supply point, only to discover the runners who had been hauling ammunition all night had been cut down or wounded, and the resupply line was completely severed. They were alone. Bazilone and his surviving assistant gunner, Sergeant Nacella, checked every tin, every pouch, finding only scattered, loose rounds, not nearly enough to restart the heavy guns. The only functioning weapons left were the men's personal rifles and pistols, but against the thousands of determined attackers now closing in, these were utterly inadequate. The exhausted Marines around them, who had been relying on the heavy guns to break the human waves, looked on in stunned despair. Bazilone knew that if the line broke here, Henderson Field would fall, and every American on the island would be trapped and executed. With the Japanese literally scrambling over the bodies of their dead and climbing the sandbag wall of the pit, Bazilone saw the final wave coming directly toward the gaping, silent muzzle of his machine gun. He had minutes, maybe seconds, to solve a problem that artillery, air power, and 2 heavy machine guns had failed to solve. With the Japanese screaming their final battle cries and mere feet from overrunning the position, Bazilone made a decision born not of desperation, but of pure, furious professionalism. He would not wait to be killed. He would take the initiative. His heavy machine gun was silent, but his hands were not empty. He grabbed his M1903 rifle, fixed the bayonet to the end of the barrel, pulled his pistol, and grabbed a razor-sharp machete he had used to clear the jungle. He hurled his last remaining grenades into the surging crowd, clearing a small gap, and then, in an act of staggering audacity, he charged the enemy. This was the impossible fight. Instead of waiting for the bayonet-wielding Japanese to enter his pit, Bazilone leapt over the sandbags and plunged into the mass of humanity, initiating brutal close-quarters combat on his own terms. In the chaos of the darkness and the rain, he became a single-man cyclone of destruction. Using the long, sharp bayonet, the butt of his rifle, and the heavy machete, he fought like a man possessed, targeting officers, silencing light machine gun nests, and carving a swath through the Japanese front line. His desperate primal fury confused the attackers, who expected a static defense, not a single enraged Marine charging directly into their concentrated push. He moved constantly, utilizing the few remaining loose pistol rounds to take out key targets, and then returning to the savage use of the steel. For nearly 30 minutes, he fought alone in the dark, fighting not just to kill, but to buy the few precious minutes necessary for the Marines around him to recover their nerve, reload their individual rifles, and reinforce the gaps that his action had temporarily created. His stand was a singular act of savage courage that shocked the Japanese attack, forcing them to divert their focus and preventing the critical breach that would have doomed the entire perimeter. As the last desperate, disorganized remnants of the Japanese assault melted back into the jungle, driven by the sheer exhaustion and terror of their losses, a dreadful silence fell over Bazilone's sector. When the faint, gray light of dawn finally broke through the perpetual tropical rain, the full, shocking scale of the carnage was revealed. The ground in front of the machine gun pits, already soaked with rain and mud, was now a mass of blood and bodies. As the exhausted Marines ventured out of their foxholes to survey the damage, they began the grim work of counting the cost of the night. The astonishing truth was that directly in front of and surrounding Bazilone's position, Marines counted over 40 Japanese bodies, and these were only the men killed in the final close-quarters breach attempt. Many of these soldiers bore wounds that were not the result of the machine gun's massed fire, but the brutal, targeted wounds of a pistol, a rifle butt, or the bayonet and machete. This was the 40-man tally, the estimate of the toll exacted by Basilone during his half-hour solo charge. The sheer ferocity of his impossible fight had not only stopped the breakthrough, but had annihilated the command structure and morale of that Japanese unit. Basilone had not simply killed, he had personally destroyed the Japanese assault wave in his sector, leaving a scene of such singular, savage carnage that it confirmed the almost unbelievable reports. The Marines who witnessed the aftermath were stunned. One man, out of ammunition, wounded, and fighting alone, had somehow achieved the defense of an entire sector, performing an act that was immediately recognized by his comrades as one of the greatest feats of individual heroism in the history of the Corps. The evidence was irrefutable. Basilone's personal stand had prevented the total collapse of the line, guaranteeing the survival of Henderson Field for another day. Despite the profound psychological and physical exhaustion following his close-quarters annihilation of the Japanese assault and suffering severe burns to his hands from handling the overheating machine gun barrels, John Basilone was not finished. The Japanese forces, though repulsed, were regrouping in the jungle, and a renewed, desperate counterattack was inevitable when the night returned. Basilone knew that a line held by rifles and pistols could not survive another major banzai charge. His imperative was simple: get the heavy machine guns back online. He left his position and, armed with a pistol, spent the remainder of the day making hazardous, solitary trips into the nearby, still contested jungle to scavenge. He held the line was not just a title for his initial bravery. It defined his relentless follow-up. He located a discarded machine gun and, retrieving vital spare parts and ammunition belts, returned to his pit. He worked tirelessly, ignoring his own painful burns, cleaning, repairing, and remounting the machine guns with the few men he had left. By the time the Japanese launched their final desperate assaults that evening, their last gasp attempt to take the airfield, Basilone's heavy guns were miraculously back in action. The Marine perimeter, though battered and stretched thin, survived the final onslaught. Officers throughout the 1st Marine Division quickly understood that the integrity of the Lunga perimeter during that pivotal night was due almost entirely to the sustained, desperate firepower of Basilone's position. His willingness to sacrifice himself, first by running ammunition, and then by charging the enemy with a bayonet, and finally by performing emergency repairs under fire, became the central, heroic event that saved the entire operation and sealed the fate of the Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. The impossible fight waged by Gunnery Sergeant John Basilone quickly transitioned from a harrowing battlefield story into a national legend. For his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry during the defense of Henderson Field, Basilone was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest military decoration, becoming the first enlisted Marine of the Second World War to receive the prestigious award. His recognition was immediate and massive. Suddenly, the anonymous, grim reality of the Pacific War had a face, and Basilone was instantly catapulted into the spotlight, becoming a reluctant hero of the American home front. He was brought back to the United States to spearhead war bond tours, where his sheer star power helped raise millions of dollars for the war effort, becoming the very embodiment of the unwavering American spirit. Yet, despite his fame and his safe status, Basilone despised the attention. He considered himself a Marine, not a celebrity, and felt profoundly guilty being away from his comrades still fighting in the Pacific. He repeatedly requested a return to combat, eventually succeeding. The final act of the legend of Basilone unfolded on the sands of Iwo Jima in February 1945. Basilone was killed on the first day of the invasion while single-handedly destroying a heavily fortified Japanese blockhouse, another act of heroism that posthumously earned him the Navy Cross. His death was a staggering loss, but his sacrifice cemented his legend forever. Basilone's stand at Guadalcanal was more than an individual act of bravery. It was a physical manifestation of the unbreakable will that ultimately defined the U.S. victory in the Pacific. His courage remains an enduring benchmark of the Marine Corps, a permanent symbol of the fact that even when the ammo is gone and the odds are impossible, one committed individual can still hold the line.